we're coming on to our next panel, which is the governance and regulation of AI. So our panel chair is Jacob Mercander, who is Head of Science and Technology Policy at the Tony Blair Institute. Here he is. We also have Anna Lindsay, Partnerships Lead at VoiceBox. We have Catherine Yesholamak, who is Deputy Director of Strategy at the Responsible Tech Adoption Unit. And we have Tommy Schaefer-Shane, who is AI Policy Manager at the Centre for Long-Term Resilience.
So hello, everyone, and also many thanks to the organizer for having us for this panel. I was told that we would start with an introduction of who we are and why we're here, but I think that has almost been accomplished excellently. I'll still give each of the panel chairs a moment to introduce themselves and their organization. Starting with myself, I'm the Director of Science and Tech Policy at the Tony Blair Institute. For those of you who don't know the Tony Blair Institute, it's a global political advisory organization operating in 40 countries. And we have a particular focus on science and tech, particularly because we believe that that is the best way at this state in time for governments to get things done, whether that is in healthcare and in public administration. But we'll get back to that later also when we talk about responsible governance. With that, I hand over to first Anna, and then Catherine, and then Tommy.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna and I'm the Partnerships Lead at VoiceBox. For those of you who don't know, VoiceBox is a youth organisation and content platform, and we work with tech firms, non-profits and governing bodies to improve the products and policies that impact young people. We have a particular focus on online life, AI and media literacy, including our recent report that investigated the impact of AI chatbots on young people's mental health and relationships.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Catherine Yesholamak. So I'm the Deputy Director in the Responsible Tech Adoption Unit, previously called CDI. So we do public and private sector adoption of AI. We also look at innovation and creating how the government can support innovative AI businesses. And then we do quite a lot of that work on public attitudes and public attitudes towards the adoption of technologies. A tiny bit on my background. So prior to being Deputy Director in the RTA, I set up the Frontier Model Task Force, which is now the AI Safety Institute, where I was Head of International. And before that, I have a background in digital regulations. So thank you so much for having me today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tommy Schaefer-Shane. I'm a Policy Manager at the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. So we're a think tank that's based in Westminster, and we have a particular focus on helping governments understand and mitigate what we call extreme risks. So these are kind of large-scale problems that predominantly come from technologies. So these are things like AI-enabled disinformation, the creation of bioweapons or other forms of terrorism, the use of AI to create child sexual abuse material. So all the cheery stuff, we try and help the government deal with those problems. And yeah, looking forward to talking about these issues on the panel. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all, and I'm happy to have such also diverse panel ranging from both government and civil society organization. I think just to frame the debate slightly before handing off with the first question is that I think when we talk about AI regulation today, we really have to keep in mind that this is a reference to a range of policy areas that are somewhat related but also quite distinct. For example, the European AI Act is really a product safety legislation, whereas we can also think around AI regulation in terms of national security. We can think around it in civil and human rights, which also some other pieces of legislation. And in the US, for example, you have the AI Bill of Rights. So there are very different paradigms to it. So before we dive in to look at UK legislation specifically, I just wanted to ask you, Anna, first, what are the specific challenges, or if you so will, policy issues that you think are most pressing when it comes to AI and that governments should have their eyes on?
Yeah, of course. So at VoiceBox, we have a couple of areas of concern that we think need to be addressed. First is ads. Ads are becoming increasingly intuitive and sneaky as they harness the power of AI to affect the people that use social media and other tech products. We've seen this already with Snapchat, who push sponsored messages in chat to users who use their, I can't remember what it's called, their AI chatbot, which is called My AI, I believe, but don't quote me on that one. And users are fed messages that look like a lovely, friendly message from the chatbot, but it is in fact a sponsored ad. Snapchat also recently released a product called My Selfie, which uses generative AI to push hyper-personalized ads featuring the user's face to the user. It's kind of hidden behind this facade of you can create fun stickers and fun like pictures and videos of yourself with wigs and stuff. And controversially, if you use My Selfie, you're automatically opted into the ad feature and you have to manually opt out. And considering Snapchat's predominantly teen user base, this is of massive concern to us. Second is the rise in personified AI, particularly AI chatbots, which are positioned to be a friend or a partner to the user. We know that young people are becoming increasingly attached to these bots and are shutting themselves out from the real world as the bot draws them in. We're also very concerned that they're contributing to poor attitudes towards women and girls. A lot of the female bots that we've tested present as very submissive and consistently open to sexual advancements, which is feeding an already harmful stereotype. And it's also worth noting that there is an increase in not suitable for work AI chatbots hitting our app stores, which are designed purely for sexual gratification. These have, a lot of them anyway, have very sort of lackluster privacy policies. It's not very clear where messages and images are sent, but we found evidence that young people are sending explicit images to these bots, but it's not clear where they're being stored. So this is another privacy concern for us that we think needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Thank you. And I was going to say, even if those are not very uplifting topic, they are very important ones to address. And I think we'll get back to that some of that has been a long-standing discussion when it comes to online safety and also the online safety bill. But before we dive too much into, I'm sure we will come back to chatbots and misinformation, also sexual abuse. Tommy, I want to hear, do you also have additional areas of concern in the space of AI risk and harms that you also think is important for governments to address?
I think the thing that I would point to is the challenges of doing this regulation when the technology is moving very fast and we don't have very good visibility of what's going wrong. So we rely a lot on civil society groups to kind of point out some of the harms that are occurring, but we don't always know what's going on behind the scenes and how this can kind of indicate where the technology is heading. So I think in that context, what we're particularly interested in is how you, I guess, number one, build the visibility of what is going on with these systems right now and what that says about the future. Things like instant reporting and researcher access to some of the models so they can conduct proper external research. The second point is how you start to build those standards in the companies so that they're building in responsible ways. One of the challenges is we haven't defined what all of these standards should be. So again, there's a kind of bit of uncertainty there for us to manage while we kind of hone that over the next few years. And then the third is around how you get the right institutions in place. So when it comes to the chatbot, it's a great example. It's really worrying. I mean, there seems to be hundreds of millions of people who are now using these chatbots. Is Ofcom going to be looking at that? Do they have the resources that they need? Do they have the funding to deal with that? Is that a different regulator's responsibility? So trying to figure out, where does the AI Safety Institute fit here? Where do other existing regulators fit here? Do we need a new regulator? How do we get the right institutions in place to manage this kind of fast-changing technology? These are kind of three areas of visibility, standards, and the right institutions that we're thinking about quite a lot at the moment.
Yes, I think this might be a good place in the panel for you also to come in and reason a bit about how the government are thinking around these issues, both the substantial risk and harm that we heard, but also some of the procedural challenges that Tommy mentioned.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I guess from a government perspective, we have to balance a range of factors. One of those is innovation, and one of them is also safety, public trust, etc. I think the approach that we've taken as the UK government is to think about sector-specific regulations applying to AI in deployment. So, if you're in healthcare, you're regulated by your healthcare regulator when the AI is deployed. The reason we've done that, and I actually think it's the right thing to do, is because AI will be in everything that we use at some point. You could also argue people think it's new. It's been in what we've been using for quite a long time. So we think that that's the best way to do it, because having a huge overarching framework which effectively regulates the whole of the economy is not great for innovation or business. So that's the approach that we're taking at the moment to regulating AI. We obviously announced in the King's speech that we would be introducing an AI bill when parliamentary time allows. That definitely is the plan. I think the focus of that bill will be looking at where are the gaps that the sector-specific regulation can't help with. So are there specific areas that we think that there is a gap? Probably that is focused around some of the issues more around safety in the largest models, but that is like very, very much a live conversation at the moment. The other thing I would say is, yes, I agree with the point about regulatory capacity, and do regulators have the right skills to do some of this? What I would say is that there's 2 points. So one thing that we do in the RTA is think about how can we build more professional networks of people that work with AI. So we do quite a lot of work around third-party AI assurance. So it's not just an issue of what capacity do regulators have to do this work. It's also, are there the right people out there that can even do this work, that have the right range and mix of skills? So we've been doing quite a lot of work in the Responsible Tech Adoption Unit to try and think about what are those skills and who are those people that can support that. And the other thing I would say is, obviously, we have the DRCF, which has been doing loads of really good work in this space already. I think they published a report on AI regulation first quarter of this year. And we work really closely with them. So I think we are, as a government, trying to incentivise join up across the piece using organisations like the DRCF to address some of the gaps that might exist because of the sector-specific approach.
So thank you for that. And I think we will come back to both the specific bill that you announced, or at least mentioned, that has been announced, but perhaps also what can be done within existing frameworks and updating that. So, and if we start with going back to what you mentioned about both advertisement and also chatbot, I think here we're probably talking mainly about Ofcom and CMA. Do you feel that there is enough mandate and resources within existing regulators to address these, or how do you think that the government should be approaching this to also account for some of the new harms that you mentioned you have been seen emerging in the past 1.5 years?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of do they have the resources, it's so difficult to keep up with what's emerging in the AI and online space, because there's something new that appears, pretty much every day. The Online Safety Act is already behind, and I don't think we want the same thing to happen with the proposed AI bill. I think it's very important that there's not a sort of us versus them approach when it comes to working with developers. I think the government should be working with developers to create a framework that's workable but prioritises user safety. And I also think the government should be listening to what young people have to say. Our young people have told us that while they are enthused by the prospect of AI, they are extremely concerned as well. And I don't think that's something that should be ignored. I think we should be consulting them and asking them what they want and what they think needs to happen.
So I think I'll split this into two different threads of conversation we can follow. We'll start with Tommy to build on this relationship with the developers that you brought up, and then we can come back to see what is the consultation process that an AI bill should go through. And I guess young people will be one stakeholder in a more multi-stakeholder approach. So Tommy, if we start with thinking around the relationship between governments and labs, I know you have been part of many conversations that has to do both with American AI developers, some of them based in the UK. What do you think that the appetite there is to also engage in this kind of collaboration, to share models proactively with developers or with the governments, but perhaps even more so also to commit to scaling policies that have actual tooth in terms of enforcement?
Well, I think we're seeing an emerging consensus that there is a need for the regulation of some of the most powerful companies developing some of this technology. who might not be touched by all of the kind of sector regulators. And I think we've seen the Secretary of State, Peter Carl, last week reiterating that the UK is planning to and wanting to put some rules in place. We've had one of the major AI developers, Anthropic, last week saying that they wanted regulation, that there was an opportunity within the UK, that there was a window over the next 18 months. Now, the tech industry, as people in this room are very aware, is not a monolithic group, and there are very different interests at play. You've seen someone like Elon Musk calling for a regulator in the US. You've seen other companies campaign very hard against legislative proposals in California earlier in the year. But I think that there is an appetite among in the UK, the government, and a lot of these kind of tech companies, and also civil society, to move towards kind of more formal binding regulation. There won't necessarily in 2025 or 2026 be trying to solve the whole problem. And as you're pointing out, Catherine, this is going to be a case of lots of different tools for different parts of the economy, because it's a general purpose technology that's going to rear its head in lots of places. But taking those first steps, to use a term the government has been invoking, the first steps towards that regulation and being decisive, I think there is appetite to do that. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is a lot in the public as well to get ahead of this regulation, just as there was in the US over the summer.
I just want to come in on that point as well, on the point you raised around kind of model access. So through the AI Safety Institute, we work really closely with the biggest AI companies on issues which include model access. We do have some model access and do test those models. So we have found that companies are keen to work with us. There's actually also kind of a business incentive for them to work with us, which is through model evaluation, they can work out how effective their models are, which acts as an incentive for them to engage. The other thing I'd say is that we obviously published in the Korea Summit, which I can't even remember when that was, but I think it was last year. Through the Korea Summit, we got agreement around some responsible scaling policies, RSPs, and we are looking at how we can get companies to get better responsible scaling policies in place. So I would say the appetite from business to engage with government is currently relatively high, although it is a fractured picture and some businesses are obviously different to others. On the point kind of around thinking about how we can bring this divide between kind of, not divide, but thinking about like the developers and like the users as kind of a binary, I completely agree. It's not. And I think working to build technical skills and people's understanding of how AI actually works is really, really important. And that's one of the things that we've done, I think, really well in DSET actually since I've been there, is an upskilling just even of like the civil servants and people that work in the area, understanding how these models work, how they arrive at the conclusions that they do. So I think that is really important. And finally, I will say just on your point kind of around how these models are being used, I think one of the things that we really find a lot is that people can't always anticipate the outcomes of their deployed models. So what we're trying to do is look at how can we support transparency around the models through things like responsible scaling policies, but also through things like model card publication. And again, one of the things that we have done so far is we've introduced a mandatory algorithmic transparency standard within the UK government's use of AI, which effectively sets out a framework for what we think model cards could look like. So we are doing quite a lot in this space, and it actually is quite a positive story. But like I said, there is still that balance that we need to focus on between innovation and supporting where there are gaps in regulation.
Yeah, so I want to come back to two questions that we have touched upon a bit. One is the stakeholder consultation, and you mentioned, for example, young people. We have talked about the developers. What are other interest groups and stakeholders that should be part of this legislative process? And perhaps a question for you, Catherine, how will they be bound in? So that's number one. Question number two has to do with international collaboration. So if we think around AI as a without border. Many of these companies might be legally registered in the US, use training data from India or the Philippines, have deployed their services in the UK. What are the minimum amounts of internationally accepted standards and mutual sort of recognition of legislation that is needed to make the ecosystem work seamlessly? Perhaps I'm handing over for you first and then for Anna and Tommy to comment.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the kind of like stakeholder engagement and consultation, I mean, this is not a very helpful answer, but just loads is going on. Like everyone is kind of being spoken to. And as I said, it kind of depends on what specific deployment use case you're talking about. So for example, my team we did a big public attitude survey around the use of EdTech and educational data. So like that is happening. And then in terms of consultation specifically on the bill, I'm sure that there will be like loads of that going on. So I could give you loads of individual examples, but I don't think that that will just be a long list. So I can highlight some if people are of interest. And then on the point around international collaboration, I think there's quite a lot here, which is, first of all, the UK is in a really good position when it comes to AI internationally. We're probably we're third in the world, basically behind US and China on a range of metrics. So we have quite a lot of influence internationally. I think in terms of international regulations, I would say my favorite topic in the world is international standards. And I feel like I say it so often that people just roll their eyes, but we need them and we are helping to develop them. Obviously, because AI is so new, one of the challenges that we have is like even setting up the frameworks for negotiating and kind of agreeing base level understanding internationally around AI. So one of the pieces of work that we are doing at the moment in collaboration with NIST in the US and the MPL here in the UK is looking at developing a taxonomy tool when discussing AI, because at the moment we don't even all use the same words. So we talk about, frontier models. That won't mean something to someone else. So what are the terms that we can use to even have the conversations we need to have around international? We're building those tools now. The other thing I would say is just like from my perspective, and something I also really care about, is like international interoperability and making sure that we're not locking anyone out by creating geographical specific requirements that then can't be met or are not relevant to other jurisdictions. So that's where we've been thinking about this role that third-party assurance can play in international. So we obviously, under the EU AI Act, it was announced that there was going to be some sort of need for third-party assurance. We are imminently, watch this space, I mean, when I say imminently, I mean this week, I'm very excited, publishing a review of the third-party assurance sector in the UK, which builds on a roadmap we published in 2021. So we're definitely doing a lot of engagement internationally around how can we create the UK as a world-leading place for assurance. And I think I will mention that I think this venue is a very good example of where the UK can have competitive advantage, which is in things like the chartering of professions. We have a really high regard for the chartering of professions globally. Is there something like that we can take to their third-party AI assurance market, which would mean that the UK was kind of the global leader in the same way it is when you're talking about chartered accountants or chartered surveyors? So we're doing quite a lot. Sorry, that was a long answer, but we are doing loads.
Thank you for that. And I think especially the accreditation of AI assurers, AI auditors is only going to grow, but there are also very many different layers of it. So, some is the kind of model testing that the AI Safety Institute is doing, but big part of it is also just good organizational governance. So the kind of IT audits that have long existed in software companies that have hitherto been missing from some of the labs due to their startup culture or more agile ways of working. So I think there's a range there. Building especially on the international collaboration piece, Tommy, I was thinking if we focus a bit more on substantive requirements on AI developers, where do you see the tension when it comes, for example, towards scoping even who would be included in this kind of regulation if you think about either thresholds and others? And the second is also, it's one thing to do test and evaluation that are helpful from an incentive point of view, what Catherine mentioned, but what can or should the hard requirement on even, let's say, pre-release approval be, in your opinion, when it comes to the most powerful models?
Interesting questions. Let me tackle them one by one. So I suppose on thresholds, this can be a point of controversy in legislation. There's the kind of the principle of who should be regulated in what way, how should this scale in a proportionate way to the resources of the company, the activities of the company, who should be regulated and why. There's a second piece, which is on a very technical level. How do you actually define that scope? So do you use things like compute thresholds, which is essentially how big the model is? That's a very imperfect measure of whether models are risky or not, and has become a big kind of point of contention in the US. So I think the point about thresholds is that, number one, they're not going to be perfect. They're going to be proxies, and we kind of have to accept that about them. It might be that those thresholds are based on compute. It could be a combination with the amount of money that's been invested or the amount of risk that we think that they have on a certain basis, as has been done in the EU AI Act. I think what's important is international alignment, and so we want to be careful about having one rule in the UK that's very different to the EU, that's very different to the US. That's going to increase the compliance burden for these companies. They're building the tech, they're having to figure out how to do it in many different ways, in different contexts. And the more that the UK aligns with other countries, it's going to provide advantages to the companies, and it's also going to mean that we have more influence as a nation. I think the other point about the thresholds is that we need to be wary of thinking that we're going to define once and for all who is regulated and how. This is going to be a process over a period of years. And I think one of the big advantages of something like what the CDEI originally did with the roadmap that you were just mentioning, Catherine, you're defining a process that's going to unfold over many years. And we think that the government's going to release a bill, but how does that factor into a longer term plan? And I think defining the thresholds and how they'll be updated, defining the standards, how they'll be updated, the regulatory requirements, how they'll change, I think has to be part of that roadmap. And just coming to the point around hard requirements versus kind of principles, it's likely that over time, again, we're going to know more about the hard requirements that we're going to want to start to put in place. I would hazard a guess that the transparency requirements make the most sense to implement harder rules earlier. These can be easy and cheap to comply with, and they can build our understanding of what other hard rules are needed because we have a better understanding of the problem. So that could be things like model cards. There has actually been some kind of legislation in the US that's along these lines about transparency of data sets. It could be around things like incident reporting, so we know when things are going wrong with these companies. We're not just relying on journalists breaking stories. So I think that's probably where we're likely to start, but we do need to see this as a process that's going to change and iterate over time, and I think the government's been quite right to describe this as an iterative process.
So I'm also conscious that we would like to leave as much time as possible for questions from the audience, because I know that this is also a topic that sparks some emotions and also some reactions and some curiosity, which is a good thing. Before doing that, I just want to ask, is there anyone on the panel here who feels that they have something pressing on their heart they want to say before we open up for questions? Anna, if your look says yes.
I just want to touch on the point about hard requirements and how we'll become aware of them as it progresses. This is true, and I'm not saying that I have the answer to this, but at the moment we're finding that a lot of the technology is being developed without the correct testing, without the correct parameters, without the correct guardrails, and they're sort of thrust into the laps of users who are then left to get on with it, as it were. So at the moment, it's the users who are being impacted by technology that hasn't been regulated properly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. And this point is probably broader even than AI development. I think it touches towards the core of creative destruction also and responsible innovation. So I think what we have seen also in technological developments in the past is that even development that might lead to higher efficiency or utility over a time period can cause very real near-term harm for users, communities, workers, from the Industrial Revolution to to today. And I don't think that we will solve those problems as part of an AI bill either. But I think maybe one hopeful thing to say here is that while we're waiting for the government to announce one bill, is that this panel is called Governance and Regulation, and regulation is only a very small part of governance. A lot of the measures and the plurality of measures needed to address the wide range of harms we've heard, from misinformation to large-scale risk, will actually be good software development practices, responsible testing and regulation, and certification procedure that can happen even in a market development. And some comes down to the responsible and ethical use by developers and users to avoid malicious use cases. So I'm just saying that regulation is important, but it's probably only a small part of addressing that puzzle that we talked about. With that, I have said quite enough, and we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience.
Good afternoon, and thank you, panel. Neil Sharpley, Federation of Small Businesses. Can I address a slightly different area that you haven't tackled yet? The problem for business at the moment is not so much the governance and regulation of AI at a high level, but legal changes that are necessary to address the commercial effects of using AI. And I'd like the panel to comment on whether they agree with and think the government should be looking at three things. First of all, I know they're already looking at data mining, and that comes about most recognisably in the creative industries, with music and graphical works being absorbed into data sets. But it also is really important, echoing what was said this morning about journalism, that people scraping journalists' material from the net and using it without payment are undermining the funding of journalism. Secondly, on a different topic, if you're doing research and development in industrial terms, you're using large data sets and expensive computing, and the small businesses who are using that are paying for it. But at the moment, the quality of the output of those systems is a questionable commodity in law. Businesses will not invest in those sort of systems and outputs unless they can be certain that they own and control what comes out of them. And what we suggest we need is some different creature, called perhaps an AI output, which deals with those particular issues. And thirdly, it's absolutely clear to everyone that deep fakes are an enormous problem in various respects, and they do affect business in some cases. The police and Ofcom will not have the resources to tackle them all. What we suggest is that business should be given the tools to do this themselves by creating, similar to the United States, image rights and voice rights that are unique to a person, to control them for moral, criminal and commercial purposes, and to be able to allege infringement and get them taken down to avoid compensation being paid by the places where they are being hosted. Those three suggestions, do the panel agree? Do they think the government should be pursuing those options?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I will start by just sharing a tiny bit of what we also hear from small businesses, because I haven't actually talked about that, but I think is relevant and very excitingly, again, being announced this week, guys. Keep your eyes open. So one of the things that we hear from, in particular from small to medium-sized businesses, is they don't know, almost, they haven't even got there. They don't know what systems they want to buy and what a system is going to do for them. So this week we are publishing our AI Management Essentials Toolkit, which is a guide for businesses to ask the type of questions that we think will help them to understand what AI systems they should be using. And we're hoping that that will be a positive step from the feedback we've been having from small and medium-sized businesses to help them adopt AI effectively and responsibly. On your points, I guess I would summarise all of them as kind of being about IP. And I would say that IP is just, I don't have any response because it is being worked through, because it is such a complicated issue. I will say it's not something that, it's something even the government has a problem with. So we are thinking about what are the IP rights of the evals that we develop in the AI Safety Institute. What does that mean? Because we've built something which is a tool for evaluating a model. Do we own that? Can we monetize it? So these questions are definitely being worked through, but there's just so many equities at the moment that it is really hard and challenging. But we're kind of actually with you because we're having those exact conversations about the products and tools that we're already developing ourselves.
Tommy, would you or Anna like to weigh in also?
I would just add that we also need to be thinking about how we support the industries that are going to be affected by this new wave of AI. And journalism, for example, is already suffering from big impacts on social media and the internet, and having kind of good funding and good practices around that industry is also an important part of that puzzle. I think on deepfakes, this is a really kind of worrying problem. I think companies are going to have their own strategies for dealing with this. One of the problems with laws is that a lot of people using deepfakes are willingly acting in criminal activity. So they're happy to kind of be there, and they already are kind of planning to break these laws. So I think a lot of this is about how society adapts to the technology that is coming. There are responsible processes we can put in place that help, like not releasing models to the public without any warning, telling anyone, suddenly with massive impacts. I think the technology industry is waking up to this and announcing products before they release them. And this is helpful for planning. Well, how is my company going to be affected by deepfakes? What can we do? And I'm sure there'll be guidance from the government to support with that. But it's going to require these adaptations in journalism and in many other sectors to make sure that they're kind of resilient to the change that's probably coming.
Yeah, and I think with knowing the risk that we have actually not addressed all of your 3 points, I just say they can all be put in the bucket of regulation that actually helps AI innovation also to flourish, as opposed to regulation that help prevent against AI risk, which is mainly what we've been talking about today. And I think actually an analogy here with even how the market is working is helpful, just to think through why we shouldn't fall into a binary opposition between innovation and regulation when it comes to AI. So just like markets are very efficient mechanisms for solving problems, they depend on state intervention and protection of property and intellectual property right to function. And also we need interventions to distribute the riches created by markets equitably across populations. Similarly with AI, even if it's a good optimization tool to solve certain kinds of computational problems, there will be technical failures and we need technical controls for them, but it will also need to have new kinds of regulation around data access, intellectual property right, maybe even mutual compatibility of platform interoperability that forces but also helps. It's the iron cage that both enable and also restrict that kind of intervention. So I think your question points towards a more hopeful way where a good regulation can actually be better towards the industry than the more confusing and not adopted regulations that we have today. I know that we have some other hands in the air, so I'll also move on. We had one question up from the gentleman.
Okay, Catherine, as you are the government representative, this will go to you, but I guess the rest of the panel can chime in. No one is immune from being excluded, and those marginalized are at greater risk. That's a quote from Dr. Joy Buolamwini. She is the one who figured out that the machines cannot see us as we see ourselves. This is a British passport. It was issued August 2017. I did same-day delivery service to ensure that everything was okay. Now, I was told that the passport photos that I brought, as you can see, I wear spectacles, were not suitable. So I was told at the HMO passport office to take photographs at their photo booths, okay? I wanted my passport that same day. I did what they asked me to do. March 2018, I come Heathrow, try and use my passport at the e-gates, access denied. So I had to go to the manual desk. I fly to Barajas, Madrid, no problem entering Spain. Fly back to Gatwick, try to use the e-gates, access denied. September 2018, I'm heading for a conference at the Council of Europe. Fly to Frankfurt, enter Germany, no problem. Come back to Stansted, access denied at the e-gates. 3 different UK airports. I can't enter the country of my birth using the e-gates, have to use the manual desk. So I say, okay, not going to use the e-gates anymore. March 2019, come to the UK, head to the man desk. Border agent says, user error. I've been in technology since 1990, so I know how to use technology. Then October 2019, an article comes out, New Scientist, by Adam Vaughan, who's now at the Times, saying that the Home Office deployed this technology knowing it wouldn't work for people with my skin type. That's the Fitzpatrick scale 6. Okay, so that is exclusion by design. So this is my lived experience. So now, 2024, the government has done the digital equivalent of stop and search. So you've created a profile that has I'm caught up in this, and I'm wondering, as a minority, why should I trust any technology that the British government, give me a reason to trust the technology that you're deploying, because clearly you have people, the training data is not sufficiently diverse, or the developers are not sufficiently diverse. Exclusion by design is a big problem. It's one thing to be excluded by a private company, it's another thing to be excluded by the state.
So, first of all, thank you for sharing your experiences, and sorry this happened. And second, thank you also for raising a very important point, which is that data-driven technologies do reflect and amplify the biases available in their training data. This is a technical fact, and it has been established both by Joy Bolamvini, by Deb Rudge, and many others leaders in the space. If we go to see what we can do about it, perhaps we can divide this into two different buckets. Katrin, would you like to first say a bit how the government is thinking about, when talking about digitalizing public services, how we can protect against such biases? And then also, Anna and Tommy, please feel free to fill in more from a technical perspective of what are the different post-processing or pre-processing techniques to address biases in data.
Thank you. So what would I say? I agree. Thank you for sharing that example. And I think it's really important to understand like the human in technology. I think we quite often end up thinking about big businesses or big models, but actually the end user is probably the person who is most affected by any of the deployment or developments. And also a range of scales as well. Like I would just add, there's issues around things like environment. There's a whole host of questions that exist both on an individual and big picture basis when it comes to digital inclusion. What I would say is, what do we do? Two things that I would say. I think the first thing I would say is it is important that we, as the government, when we're procuring services, it's actually very, in my time in government, I haven't seen a lot of self-developed government services. We're seeing a lot of procurement of external providers. It's important that we understand what we're procuring, what data that's been trained on, because often, like, what am I trying to say? The person who is buying it might not have any understanding of how that model has been developed or trained, or any idea what even model training is. They just think that they're going to get an outcome which is going to be quicker, which means that they need to be upskilled in understanding what questions they should be asking of the models that they're procuring, and also thinking about understanding about what the consequences of the system that they're procuring are. So going back to what I said about the algorithmic transparency reporting standard, what we found where people have been using that in the public sector, they've not only found it useful in terms of like it's better, so citizens can understand how AI is being used and there's transparency around it. It's also helped people who are deploying models to ask questions of themselves about whether or not AI is the right tool for them, and also understand how the AI is going to have consequences for how they work, which means that you can have a better human in the loop process. So that's one way which I think the government is looking at this. I think the other thing I would say is that bias in the model training data is a really, really challenging and systemic issue for both developers and government. So we have done a couple of things in the Responsible Tech Adoption Unit. So one thing is we're looking really closely at bias auditing. So how can you check how biased your system is? I think the other thing which we've done is something called the Fairness Innovation Challenge, which looks at stimulating a market for companies that look at things like bias and fairness. And an example of that is one of the funding projects we funded looks at the use of AI in job sifting. So which groups are most disadvantaged? What does that mean? So we are definitely looking at it and definitely looking at developing kind of more specific tools. But I would say it's often a very complex supply chain, and that's why it's important that we have kind of these broad kind of tools that can be applicable across the system, like transparency and explainability requirements.
Well, I just echo the thanks for raising this point. It's really important. I think in terms of technical fixes, there are some techniques that can be used, but I think we need to be looking at this more holistically, not as a technical problem, but as a kind of wider social problem. One of the ways that this is dealt with in other industries is that you have very good risk management practices. So it's clear who is on the hook when something goes wrong. And that can increase trust if you know that people are accountable rather than thinking that no one's ever going to get in trouble when these things aren't implemented in the right way. It can also help you ask deeper questions about, should we even be using AI for this problem? Before we get to the point of trying to de-bias it in various ways, why are we doing that? What are the other unintended consequences of doing so? If you automate all passport gates, that might introduce new problems, even if the AI is working effectively about access and for various different people. So we need to be thinking about this in the round. I think also transparency is really important, and I would like to emphasise that the UK government and Catherine's team in particular have done really pioneering work here around the algorithmic transparency recording standard, which is maybe not the best name. It's a bit difficult to kind of get out, but this is about the government being open and transparent about the risk assessments that it's done. It can then be held accountable to those risk assessments. My slight critique is that not everyone is using it right now, and I think we've got about 8 cases so far. There's probably more of those, maybe more on the way, but we just really need to make sure that gets used. But transparency is one way we can kind of address this. But people being on the hook for when it goes wrong, I think, is one of the big lessons from other industries.
Yes. So I also think this is a useful point in time to point out the differences between different logics of regulating AI. So, for example, there is a tendency, and the European AI Act does this, to evaluate technology a bit in isolation and putting up requirements that technology should meet. But another way of looking at it, and this was the approach taken in the US Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022, which Senator Wyden and his team championed, this was to define what is the current process for doing something, like, for example, in this case, border controls, and justify how and why introducing an AI system would enhance the process. So the baseline was a pragmatic baseline of the status quo, and you could justify the intervention not by the technology was perfect, but this was improved. And I think this is a clear case in which it would fail such a test. Now, I know we only have a few minutes left, so my idea would be we can take 2 final questions. I know we have one up here. Do we have one more? Yes, we also have an online question. Great. So apologies to the others who raised their hand. Happy to chat afterwards and invite you to come forward. So can we get quick questions, and then we will have a response from panel? Yeah.
Dominic Pinto, and I've been around probably not quite as long as some in the room in this kind of area. Over 40 years, I seem to remember. A lot of this strikes me as being very, very similar to the same sort of basic fundamental problems which we were discussing in PIPCOM and elsewhere 30 or 40 years ago. Status quo is a moving feast, so we're always moving on. So we want solutions or approaches which are not time limited by the technology. That's one point. Can we anticipate, if you like, the future? Well, it's going to be difficult, but at least that would, I think, need to be a fundamental principle, rather than relying on sector regulators, et cetera, all of whom seem to have fundamentally failed, whether it's from sewage to telecoms to anything else. And the other thing is assessments. I don't think you can rely on the government approaches to these things. They don't assess, for example, the changes to the winter fuel allowance. So they're not thinking about users. Government is about administrative convenience, and that goes back at least 40, if not 50 years. And the commercial sector, the private sector, the vendors are always going to sell you a solution which they say will give you, if you like, deliver what you need. And they have a commercial imperative to sell, and the people buying have a commercial imperative probably to demonstrate to their own board or owners that they're doing something, and it's good and it's lovely. So I don't think so far that I've heard anything today which really addresses anything fundamental.
Yes, we will see. Shall we take one more question and then get back to the panelists? Yes, online question.
Yeah, the online question is from Suvash Karka, who asks, in terms of AI standards and development frameworks, how is the UK leading the way and collaborating with international partners? So quite a different question.
Yeah. Catherine, would you like to start addressing the two, and then we can see if other panelists would like to fill in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, what would I say? So, in terms of specifically what we are doing, I think it's really important to explain the approach we're taking at the moment. So, my team, this is why we're looking at the third-party assurance, like stimulating a third-party assurance market. What we don't want to be doing as the government is like rubber stamping individual models or suggesting this model is right, this one is wrong. What we want to do is build an industry and profession around people that have the right skills to do that. So, for example, thinking about how we can integrate that with pre-existing risk management assessments that happen within industry, thinking about how it can tie to cybersecurity standards. So I would say we're doing quite a lot about thinking how can we as the government get people who have the right expertise and skills, who we acknowledge aren't necessarily us, to make sure that these systems themselves are safe, responsible, ethical, fair. So I think that we are taking the right approach when it comes to looking at and thinking about regulating systems. I also would say that the problem is if you look at the sectors, it's not it's not an issue that they can't do it. It's that this technology is really, really new, like especially since, since basically the last 2 years and kind of the advent of ChatGPT, this has become a really big issue. So what I would say is, I believe that those regulators, the sector-specific regulators, probably can do a really good job. But I think it's about having the right range of skill sets and the right mix of people in those roles. And those people, A, might not exist at the moment, genuinely. B, that's really a new way of working in a socio-technical way. I mean, I love it, but it is really new. Like, you don't tend to find that. You have your development teams and then you have your deployment teams. They don't work together. So thinking about how we can do that, I think that can happen. And C, one of the challenges we have here is kind of, I actually think links to what you were saying before, like what does a future world with AI look like? It looks like a whole new range of professions. It looks like a whole new range of jobs. And I think understanding and explaining what the future world can look like and what those jobs are is the business of the government. And that is what we're trying to do at the moment. And I think by doing that, we can address points A and B, which is give people with the right skills and expertise, bring them together in new ways of working. So I actually am very positive about it because, I mean, shock, but also because we are doing genuinely, I think, world-leading work in this space, especially when you look internationally, which ties to the online question. So what are we doing internationally when it comes to setting standards? We are doing quite a lot. So as I mentioned before, we've developed a taxonomy tool, which looks at how you can talk about AI and its implementation across borders. We're doing that with NIST and negotiating at the OECD in Paris, I think in 2 weeks' time, although I may have the date wrong. So we're doing quite a lot of work internationally. I talked about the transparency standard. We have a partnership with Estonia on that, where they're deploying it. And they're leading from taking our approach. We also have been working with the Chilean government to look at how they could adopt the algorithmic transparency standard. We also have the AI Standards Hub, which brings together both international standards bodies, but also organisations like the Alan Turing Institute to look at supporting the development of standards internationally. So I would say we're doing quite a lot. I will say, just like my personal view, is we could be doing more. As I said at the beginning, I love standards, so I think we could be doing more. But I think what is interesting, and I have noticed, is that actually, if you look at last year, there was a big flurry of activity around AI safety. Everyone, ChatGPT really burst onto the market. And then there was this massive, massive kind of huge amount of activity around Bletchley and, setting up the AI Safety Institute, which is good and needed. But to get to a sustainable international regulatory regime, you need things like standards, infrastructure around those standards. And I think what I've noticed, which is a real positive for me, is that, we've kind of moved on a little bit from some of all of that hype to like, how do we actually do this practically? And what I am seeing working within government is really interestingly, having been banging on about standards for a very long time, people are actually coming to ask me about them now, which is really, really exciting. I feel like said no one ever, but like was for me. So I am feeling optimistic that A, we are already leading globally when it comes to doing that, but B, I think that is definitely only increasing in my experience.
Anna, any closing remarks from your side?
Yeah. I think it's important to just touch on a lot of the conversation has taken quite a top-heavy approach. So I'm going to come at this from a community-based organisation in that I think there is scope to visit people in libraries, youth clubs, schools. There are people who I'm sure would have so many amazing insights and potential remedies to discuss that currently aren't being listened to, who maybe don't have the time to fill in an online consultation but would be willing to have a 10-minute chat at their local hub. And I certainly think that's something that could also be used in the media literacy and AI literacy space. I think we're not focusing enough on equipping people with the skills and tools to tackle both the benefits and the risks that AI brings to them.
So that we will need to start closing down this panel now and I would like to thank everyone in the panel for their contribution. Two just final sentences also on my part is that I think a certain unease and about where we are and also an acknowledgement about the similarities with history is important. And I think none of us should pretend that we have AI regulation in the bag. This will be a very evolving field, and even in the consultations will surface new tensions between the interest of different groups. But just to make a very sort of simple analogy, where I right now live here in London, just about King's Cross, we're opening a new coffee shop, and they're putting up stickers saying to residents in the area, we're hearing your concerns, this might create noise, is it okay to open it? And it's a very small intervention in a local space that has a lot of consultation about the real world impact. A large language model can be rolled out and has 100 million of users, change the working life of hundreds of millions of people. And right now that has zero oversight or foresight or public consultation. So this is not about circumventing or reinventing the wheel. It's more about to see how do we uphold reasonable standards for societal implication as we are in different spheres of public life. With that, I would like to say thank you for everyone also who asked questions, and perhaps an applause for the panelists as well.